We're going to be talking about software instruments and how we can start to go beyond using pre-made samples and loops to actually starting to create some original melodies and chord progressions and so on. So in GarageBand, we're going to open up a new empty project, and we're greeted with these options. You might have details open, but these are your basic options. Today, instead of an audio track, which is what we use for dropping in loops or recordings from our Zoom recorders, we're going to use the software instrument option, this green one. And so we're going to say create a new software instrument track. When we do that, kind of a lot happens. This first thing that you might notice is this little musical keyboard. This allows you to use your Mac keyboard as a piano roll. So when you don't have your MIDI controller available, you can still type sort of like you're playing on a piano. And this is a substitute for when you just have your computer and you don't have access to a MIDI controller to play. And so we can always bring this up or hide it by hitting Command K. The K is for keyboard. So if I hit Command K, the keyboard goes away. Command K again, it comes back. And so that's really useful to get that in your head, Command K for keyboard, to just be able to show and hide the keyboard. Down here are some controls. This part actually changes based on the software instrument we're using. So for this classic electric piano, which is the default instrument, we have a couple of effects, tremolo, chorus, some reverb, ambiance, and then some basic equalization like treble and bass, and overdrive would be like distortion. So we can affect the settings of our instrument down here. For now, I'm going to close that by clicking on this smart controls or pressing B just to give us more screen real estate. And I'm also going to close this library. We're going to just work with the classic electric piano for now. So I just clicked on that to close it. I can always reopen it by hitting Y or clicking on it again. So here's my timeline. You'll see I'm at a tempo of 120 beats per minute. I have a little 1, 2, 3, 4 count in that happens before I start recording. That's useful if you're recording in the middle of a song that already has other music, so you can jump in on time without being late. When you first start recording your very first track, it just means you have to wait a moment. And then here's our metronome. I'm going to leave that on at the beginning since I don't have any other music in here for context. The metronome will help me stay in time. So I'm going to hit Command K to bring up my keyboard, and if I type on here, you'll see that I'm able to type on my Mac keyboard and I get electric piano sounds, which is really cool. So with this open, I'm going to click on the record button or hit R on my keyboard, and you'll notice R isn't one of the letters on here. What they're saying is for this C, I would hit A, W for the black key, E, and so on. And if I want to shift around, notice I'm playing in the middle of a theoretically very large piano, I can use Z and X to move up and down octaves. So now I'm playing lower notes. Sounds kind of rough. If I hit X, I'll go up a couple octaves. And so that allows me to play, even though I have a very short piano here, a wider range of notes. So I'm going to leave it right here in the middle and hit R to start recording. There's my little count in. Okay, so I've recorded a few notes. I hit spacebar to stop. You could always hit the stop button up here. But now I've recorded, this is called MIDI data. And when we say a MIDI controller, we're talking about the same thing. A MIDI controller is meant to help you create MIDI data. So I'm going to hit Command K to hide my keyboard. And if I look here, you can see sort of a record of the notes I played. Here are the two longer lower chords. You'll see they were just 2 notes each. And then those little rolls and that sort of melody I was playing are visible there. That's a good general, kind of way to visualize what I just played, but we can get much more detailed. MIDI data is a pretty brilliant thing. So if I click on this and I hit P, it'll bring up what's called piano roll. And if you don't remember that, you can always click on the little scissors too. When you have a region selected, it'll open it in the piano roll. And so here are the notes I just played, and they're represented on, they call this the piano roll because you see from bottom to top, we have progressively higher and higher notes on a piano. So this C2 extends horizontally across there. Anything that happens to be in this particular band is a C2. If I click on a note, it's played. What you'll see is this is sort of like a diagram where time takes place across the x-axis and pitch is on the y-axis. And so I played these first 2 notes together. and then I played. And so each one of these represents a note, and its size horizontally represents the duration of that note. So if I wanted this note, instead of ringing out, to be really short, I can actually grab it and shorten it. And here's the change that made. Instead of what it was before. I usually like to turn the metronome off when I'm editing. Once I have my rhythm in place, I don't necessarily need it anymore. You'll notice all of these notes are green. That's just the default, what we call velocity. It means it's played at the default sort of intensity. So what I want to do is say maybe I wanted to have these chords be softer. I could highlight these 4 notes, and velocity was set right here at a value of 98. The maximum velocity would be 127. And so this note, you'll notice it's played much more harshly now. And so if I were to drag this velocity down, they'll be played much more softly. In fact, that was so soft I couldn't really hear it. Let's try it again. So you'll notice my lower chords are now played more softly than the upper melody. So that's one way you could go through, and even if you were not playing on a MIDI controller, which senses your velocity automatically, you could create a little bit of dynamics within your MIDI data. And so I did an okay job of being on rhythm, but you'll notice if we zoom in that some of these notes aren't really perfectly, like this was not quite on the bar, right? These two, I kind of like the way they sound, rolling one slightly before the other. Listen. I like that better than if they're perfectly in time, but my melody I do want to be in time. So what I'm going to do is highlight, just by drawing a box, all the notes that were in the sort of the right hand part of my piano playing, my melody, and I'm going to do what's called quantization. And what that does is it looks at each note and it pushes it to the nearest perfect, in this case 16th note. I could choose whole notes, half notes. I'm going to go with 16th since I had some short notes in there. If I chose 8th note, they might get bumped too far. So I'm going to choose 16th and click it, and you'll notice a few things shifted around. These two notes now, unfortunately, are played right exactly at the same time. They're both have been shifted to the same 16th note. I don't like that edit, so I'm going to hit Command Z. Let's work only with our longer notes. I'm going to highlight those and then hold Shift and highlight those and push them all to the nearest 8th note, and watch what happens to the notes in the middle of the screen. They're nudged a little bit. Now all of these were pushed to the nearest 8th note, and they're going to be perfectly on beat for those 8th notes. And so if I play this with a metronome, you'll notice it sounds slightly more in time than it was when I actually recorded it myself. So each of these notes hits exactly on a metronome hit. So pretty good. I would say this note probably came a little too early. And so I might come back through and actually drag these notes around until they sound just right. So let's listen again to this bar. Okay, decent, but I think there was a little too much delay between this note and the third. So I'm going to shift it a little bit in time and maybe bump that there. Let's try one more time. So I'm happier with that roll there. So I've got some MIDI data here. I'm happy with the placement of the notes and the velocity of the notes. Now I can start to manipulate the instrument they're played on or the sound. So there's a lot of ways we could go with this. This is going to be hopefully a source of like endless exploration. But what I'm going to do is hide my editor, and with this track selected, open up my library. And here are some other vintage electric piano sounds baked in. So that was the classic one. If I click here, I'll actually change my instrument. I'm going to loop this so we can listen to it play over and over. To a classic suitcase, it's a different sounding piano. Here it goes. So there's lots of different piano sounds that I can choose from there, but it doesn't need to be a piano. There are bass sounds in here, guitars, keyboards. I love going under orchestral and finding things like the string section, the orchestral percussion kit. Of course, these notes wouldn't make sense, but it's got things like timpanis and big cymbals. It's a really nice way to add something. Brass, you can occasionally, I'll like to use the trombones in a song, but what I'll do is I'm going to choose a harp. So instead of playing this on an E-piano, those notes are now going to sound like they're being played on a harp. Let's listen. Okay, so it doesn't actually sound great with this particular set of notes. So I might try some mallets instead. How about a marimba? kind of like that sound. So something I wrote on one instrument is now being played on another. That's the power of MIDI, which I think is awesome. The other thing I want to do is open up my controls by clicking here. And you'll notice for a marimba, I've got low and high, chorus and delay, ambiance, and reverb as my options. So reverb is what makes something kind of echo out and sound like you recorded it maybe in a big empty parking garage or something. So I'm going to first yank this all the way down and see what that sounds like. So you'll notice that's what we call a dry sound. Each note doesn't really ring out beyond when the little bar ends. If I yank the reverb all the way to the other extreme, listen now. So there's almost like this echoey effect where it was recorded somewhere. So that's one way for this particular instrument to add reverb. I'm going to shut this reverb off, and we could explore those another time. But I'm going to actually start messing with some plugins for reverb and other effects. So if I click on plugins, you'll notice this marimba patch actually comes with quite a few things already being applied to it. There's some tape delay, some chorus, and an equalizer. We'll talk about those another time. But I might want to add a more specialized reverb. So I can click in an open section here and scroll down under reverb. They have several different reverb tanks to choose from. I really like Space Designer. You should absolutely mess with each of these. They all create different reverberation sounds. But Space Designer is a fun one. I can come in here and choose what size of space I want to simulate. And the warped effects can give you some really interesting experimental sounds. So I'm going to go into large spaces and pick a large indoor space. How about a plane hanger? So this should now sound, as long as this power button's on, like it was recorded in a very big plane hanger. Let's listen. Okay, so kind of harsh, not my favorite of the reverb tanks, so I might go and look for another one. Let's try a clean room. Okay, so that sounds pretty good. You can also play with these sliders. The dry output refers to the unmodulated signal, what was just coming out of the marimba without this effect. Often you'll get something called wet output, and that's the reverberated, saturated output, and you can balance those sliders. Here they're calling it reverb output. So if I were to drag this down, we'll hear the same amount of reverb, but much quieter. And so I can play around with that slider to change the effect of my sound. If I decide I don't like this, I can choose no plugin by clicking on this little arrows on the right. Let's try a different effect, right? We might want to add some delay on here. Tape delay is one that I tend to like. And so now I can come in here and choose, I want to have eighth note dotted, let's go eighth note triple delay. There's all kinds of settings I can mess with, but this is going to repeat each note an eighth note triplet later than the original note happened. So let's listen. So it's a neat effect. I don't particularly like it with this set of notes, but it is a really neat thing, tape delay. And you can see there was already another one on here that was using quarter notes. So you can have multiple patches of the same effect. So I'm going to say no plugin, and we're going to now look at what's called an equalizer. This is how you can affect the frequency band of an instrument. So if we click on EQ, and I'm going to stretch this to make it bigger, this is a really powerful window. I'm going to click on Analyzer to make sure it's turned on. And what this is going to do is actually visualize for me which frequencies are being voiced with this instrument. So you've been listening to this, you know it's fairly low in the register. These are pretty low notes I played on this marimba. And so I expect, if we look here, 20 hertz is the bottom, that's the lowest bass note humans are capable of hearing. Up to 20,000 hertz, that's like way beyond a mosquito sound, super high pitch. So we're probably going to see somewhere in this band some strong notes because that's where we're playing up here. So if I hit play, we'll watch the waveform. Okay, so you can see each note is happening right around this 150 to 300 hertz is where the biggest, most powerful sounds are. And so if I wanted to play up some of my higher notes, I might actually grab some of these high frequencies and pull them up. And this is going to emphasize notes in this frequency band. So let's listen as I drag this around and play it. As I go down, you'll notice the high notes are muted. Back toward neutral. There's a lot of subtle effects you can create with an equalizer. If you've ever stood outside of a car that had loud music, you'll notice you just hear the bass coming through. You're just like the well, I can turn this on and actually cut out high frequencies. This is called a high cut or a low pass filter. And I can say anything that's kind of in this pink region, that gets cut out. And so now listen. And there we go, back to normal. The opposite of that would be to cut out the low notes, and this would make a really tinny, thin sound. That's more like if you were listening to something on a phone. So let's listen to it now. Okay, so those are my sort of my two extremes, and then everywhere in between I can emphasize these are my low notes, but I can grab these and drag to maybe quiet some of the bass, bring up a little bit of the mids, and then really bring up my high notes, right? This would be a fairly extreme equalizer curve. There are presets in here, like if I wanted a preset for brightening hi-hats on drums, this is what that EQ looks like. You'll notice it cuts out the low ends and then gives us a little sparkle up in the 4,000 to 5,000 hertz range. So I might come in here for a marimba and start by picking out kind of a fun one, right? They have a phone notch filter, which I always think is cool. It cuts out everything and makes it sound like it was recorded on a phone call. So let's listen. So that can be a neat effect that you can bring in and then take away, especially on instruments with a more bodied sound like a guitar or something. So equalizers are really powerful. You can always reset your equalizer just by dragging stuff back to the middle and kind of restore the original sound or turn it off. But that's a channel equalizer. So we've now got a way to record notes. We can manipulate those notes once they're in there by hand, by dragging them. We can quantize them to get them perfectly on beat. We can swap our instrument around. We can play with the specific controls for that instrument. We can come into our plugins area and add different effects to our track. And notice when you switch instruments, by the way, this all gets wiped out and replaced with whatever that is. So if you put a bunch of work in and you want to hear this on another instrument, you might just create a new software instrument track, move your MIDI data to there, and then pick a different instrument, right? You can also copy it by holding Option. And so I might want to have a marimba and a classic piano play these notes together. Let's hear what that sounds like. Okay, sounds a little more interesting, and I can change the balance by sliding these volume sliders around. So the last thing that I wanted to show you was a way to play things that you might not have the facility to play on a piano, right? I'm not a very skilled pianist, and so I can't always play the notes that I want recorded. So if I hold Command in my piano roll, I can actually draw notes in, right? So maybe I wanted to play this really complicated chord. I have no idea if this is actually in any key, but I can come through and add a couple more notes, right? And I might not have enough fingers on my hand to play a note like this or a chord like this. You can also draw in melodies this way. Now this is just random notes. I'm sure it's going to sound awful, but that's a way that I can create some more variety and more complexity in my music beyond my own skills as a pianist. So let's listen to whatever garbage this sounds like now. So we got to hear all those notes that they were in there just as if I had recorded them, but I actually drew them in after the fact. So that's a basic introduction to software instruments and MIDI data. From there, you should have a lot of fun going through, exploring all the different drum kits and different instruments that are available to you in GarageBand, and then going through the awesome effects that there are and starting to really create some interesting sounds. And what you can do now is take this and start to use, in combination with loops if you want, or to create totally from scratch. But here's a good place to begin work on recording your album.